Arya Stark crouched in the library of Winterfell, her breath shallow, her heart pounding a furious rhythm in her chest. She strained her ears for movement in the hallway outside, though the only sounds within the chamber were the faint rustle of yellowing pages and the distant rush of the cold wind scraping against the walls. The books were her silent companions, each filled with its own version of history, a tapestry of victories and defeats, of ancient kings and cunning knights, of sorcery and prophecy. Tonight, her own footsteps across the worn rug seemed to echo that grand heritage in the hush. Winter had come. The north was shrouded in a glittering darkness, a realm of sharp stars and drifting snowfall, fragile crystals that collected on the ledges and turrets of the great castle. Arya drew in a trembling breath. Somewhere out there, the army of the dead advanced. The entire world teetered on a precipice, undone by the unstoppable march of a cold, lifeless host. She touched the hilt of the dagger at her belt, the blade dark and gleaming, so much heavier in her grip than its size might suggest. But to Arya, it carried the weight of destiny. She thought of the many faces she had worn and the training she had endured. The teachings of the faceless men still echoed in her mind. The gift of death can be a mercy, or it can be the ultimate tool. It all depended on the skill and will of the one who wielded the blade. The knowledge that she alone might have the capacity to strike at the dead was at once terrifying and intoxicating. She recalled the sensation of needle-like focus that came when she recited her list, the names of her enemies, the litany she used to lull herself to sleep on bitter nights. It was a list she had once thought would lead her to a final vengeance. Now, standing at the edge of the world's ending, she realized that vengeance might not be enough. Her eyes flickered to the door. She knew she had only a scant few moments of calm before chaos erupted. Jon had asked her to stay safe, had wanted her and Sansa hidden away, or as far from the front lines as possible. "You're our future," he had said, voice thick with concern. But Arya's place had never been behind thick walls and locked doors. Not after everything she had survived. Losing her father, the brutal journey across war-ravaged lands, the House of Black and White, the endless training in the dark with a staff in her hand. She was a wolf of the north, born of the bitter wind and tempered by suffering. Nothing could keep her caged when her people stood in peril. Another memory flitted through her thoughts. Melisandre's ominous prophecy, the talk of shutting blue eyes forever. That red woman had been a figure of intrigue and dread. Yet her words had lit a spark of boldness within Arya. Her role was vital even if it went against all caution. The only question remaining was when to seize the chance. She forced herself to breathe slowly. She could feel the weight of her decision bearing down on her chest. If the Night King was somewhere out there, orchestrating his legion of wights, unstoppable by most living men, did she have a hope? She considered the impossible plan forming in her mind. Instead of waiting for the inevitable carnage in the Godwood, where Bran sat as bait, trusting in that single fraction of a moment that might prove decisive, what if she found the Night King before he arrived at that final stand? Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The library, once a sanctuary of knowledge and dusty peace, suddenly felt too small, too confining. Determination lined her face. She was done waiting. She refused to remain idle while the doom of the world crept closer with every heartbeat. If the Night King was not yet at Bran's side, if he lurked somewhere among the swirling snows with his white walkers, might she hunt him down? Though logic warned her this was madness, a deeper voice whispered that a Stark had to be bold. She was the one who had ventured into the enemy's lair countless times, had survived Harrenhal, the House of Black and White, the dark labyrinth of betrayal and battles. She was a ghost that slipped between worlds. And maybe, just maybe, she could slip behind the lines of the dead, find the king who commanded them, and end him before he threatened her home. It would take cunning, stealth, and an utter ruthlessness that she knew had grown within her since the day she lost her father. But she had all those things in spades. Gathering her courage, she rose from her crouch and slid into the dim corridor. Shadows clung to the high stone walls, forming shapes that seemed to dart at the edges of her vision. In the distance, she could hear the clash of steel, faint screams that told her the fighting had already begun outside the gates. Pale moonlight trickled through arrow slits, casting stark lines upon the floor like prison bars. She moved swiftly, silent as breath, heading toward the ramparts. If she was going to do this, she needed to slip outside and circle around. She had studied the shape of the battle lines from the vantage of the battlements earlier. She knew well how the whites pushed forward in relentless waves, no regard for strategy, only driven by a single will. That will belong to the Night King. Arya would stake everything on an early, decisive strike. She gripped the dagger again, letting its cold metal slide against her palm. If the legends were true, Valyrian steel was one of the few substances capable of shattering the others. And as for the king himself, he was more than just a specter of ice. He was old magic, perhaps as old as the first men, or older still. The only question was whether Valyrian steel could pierce his chest and unmake his centuries of dark power. She prayed it would, even as she cursed the risk. In her mind's eye, she pictured ghosts swirling at her side, or Nymeria, or any of the dire wolves that had once roamed these halls. She felt their spirit in her, the unstoppable, primal energy of the North. The time for fear had passed. She was Arya Stark, no one and someone. A killer forged in sorrow, a survivor by necessity. And she was going to find him. She steeled herself, slipping past a half-collapsed doorway and into the open courtyard. Overhead, the sky was awash with faint starlight obscured by drifting clouds. Flames danced along the battlements where defenders fought off the undead. Archers loosed arrows into the night, flaming missiles arching high before diving into the swarm of foes. The stench of death choked the air, mingled with the acrid smell of pitch and the copper tang of spilled blood. A chaos of shadows and light flickered across the courtyard, forming a grotesque dance of survival. She didn't look back. She had no illusions that Jon or Sansa or any of them would allow her to take this chance if they knew. They would call it folly, a sure path to death. Maybe it was. But Arya was willing to pay that price if it meant her family could live. So she slipped into the night, weaving through half-seen shapes and drifting ash, guided by the distant thunder of the oncoming horde. Tonight, she was not just a warrior. She was death in the darkness, swift and unstoppable. She would bear no face but her own, brandish no name but the one she was born with. And in the swirling chaos of Winterfell under siege, she vanished into the cold shadows with a fierce sense of purpose, determined to change the course of fate before it could claim them all. Arya slipped along the outer walls, her breath whispering in the frozen air. She surveyed the battlefield that extended beyond Winterfell's battered gates, where waves of mindless whites hurled themselves against the living. The fierce clamor of steel upon steel shook her heart, though she pressed on. The dead did not tire, did not break, and did not fear. She had known fear, and she still felt it in her bones, but it no longer had the power to stop her. Amid the torchlit darkness, bolts of dragon fire occasionally illuminated the night. She glimpsed the great shadows of dragons battling overhead, their roars splitting the heavens, the gouts of flame turning the sky a lurid orange. She thought she saw the distant, hulking silhouette of the undead dragon too, a monstrous shape that once had been Viserion. It was all a blur of swirling chaos, and time seemed to dilate, every heartbeat stretching out in a haze of blood and frost. She crouched behind a shattered cart, scanning the horizon. The Night King often commanded from behind his ranks, letting his generals, the White Walkers, steer the battle lines. But he was more than just a distant puppeteer. He moved like a hunter among them, searching for the vulnerability that would bring them to their knees. He wanted Bran, the three-eyed raven, for reasons far deeper than mortal minds could know. But if Arya reached him first, it might never come to that. Her ears caught the rasp of movement. A group of whites lurched into sight, skeletal hands clutching broken swords, eyes lit with cold fire. Their skin was torn, blackened by frostbite and the corruption of the grave. She pressed herself into the shadows, flattening her back against the wall. They staggered forward, drawn by some distant cry, or perhaps by the overwhelming scent of fear in the air. Arya waited until they were gone, her pulse racing, her vision thrumming with the closeness of it all. Every bone in her body told her to remain hidden, to keep her path a secret. But the night was young, and she had a lethal promise to fulfill. She pressed on through the gloom, her boots making barely a sound on the frozen ground. Here and there, she spotted glimpses of Winterfell's defenders, men from the north, from the Vale, perhaps a few knights from the south who had come to stand against the tide of darkness. All of them fought with desperate valor, though their lines were faltering against the endless tide. She dared not join them. She had a deadlier appointment awaiting her in the snows. A swirl of cold wind made her gasp. She raised her eyes and saw a pale figure a dozen yards away, standing in the drifting flurries like a statue made of ice. A White Walker. Tall, slender, clad in strange armor that seemed fashioned from 1,000 frosted shards. Its eyes glowed the same unnatural blue as its master. It held a spear carved from some unnatural crystalline substance. She froze, every instinct screaming that this foe was unlike any ordinary white. A White Walker possessed cunning and speed, and worst of all, it could sense the living in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. But Arya had faced such creatures before. She knew that her Valyrian steel dagger could end it. Time stretched taut as the White Walker's gaze swept the battlements. In that fleeting second, she considered unleashing her speed, dispatching the creature with a single lethal strike. But caution prevailed. Killing the White Walker would draw attention, his shriek would alert others, perhaps even the Night King. She wasn't ready for that confrontation in the open. She wanted to dictate the terms, to choose her ground. So she waited, hidden in the gloom, her breath shallow. At length, the White Walker turned and stalked into the roiling darkness, its silhouette fading into the swirling snow. Arya let out a silent exhale. She continued onward, circumnavigating the edges of the battlefield. She couldn't help but notice the bodies piling up, friends and foes alike. Each fallen man could join the Night King's army if he but lifted his icy hand. She knew she had to move quickly. Every moment lost gave the enemy more strength. At last, she reached the outskirts where the chaos was thinner, the presence of the living less dense. The motes of fire and piles of barricades behind her, she found herself in a half-ruined corner of Winterfell's outer fortifications. An area battered by ancient wars and never fully repaired. The stones were crumbling, coated in patches of ice that glowed faintly in the moonlight. She slipped through a gap in the old wall, emerging into the open countryside just beyond the castle's reach. The north stretched out under the moon's silver glare, a sea of white snowdrifts and black silhouettes of trees. The heart of winter pulsed here, the wind keening a lament for all that had been lost. Arya set her jaw. If she was going to find the Night King, she needed to search where he might position himself to watch the battlefield. Somewhere high, or somewhere intimately tied to the ancient magic that ran underfoot. Perhaps near the Godwood, or the crypts, or even on the edges of the castle where the wards were weakest. But he was not just a creature of vantage points. He was old, cunning. If she wanted to draw him out, she might need to offer him a lure. A swirl of snow carried a faint, eerie howl, and Arya's heart skipped. For a moment, it reminded her of a dire wolf's cry, but she realized with a twist of dread that it was something else, a chilling wail that seemed to ripple in the night, echoing off ice-covered stones. She pressed on, slipping into a patch of old forest that ringed the backside of Winterfell's walls, the slender branches clattering overhead like old bones. Each step sank into a thin crust of snow, crunching faintly beneath her feet. She paused, kneeling behind the gnarled trunk of a pine. A line of wights trudged across the field in front of her, too many to count. Their eyes glowed, their movements jerky and inhuman, as if controlled by a single malevolent hand. She gripped her dagger tighter. She would never be able to best that many if they spotted her. Yet, her mission was not to fight an entire army. She needed only to reach the head of the snake. There, a single precise blow could cripple the entire legion. It was a gamble, but a gambler's hand was all they had left. Time crept forward in agonizing increments. Her thighs burned from crouching, her nerves rattled by the unrelenting tension. She watched for an opening. Then it came, a break in the lines, a moment where the wights staggered forward, leaving a gap in their flank. Arya lunged through the snow, silent and swift, like a shadow parted from the night. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared it would betray her. She reached an outcropping of ancient stones, older than Winterfell itself, half sunken into the earth. Within that hollow, she tucked herself close, scanning the gloom. The air tasted of ice and old magic, tinged with the copper of blood. Somewhere to her left, a skirmish erupted, a splinter group of living soldiers ambushed by the undead. She heard cries of terror, the clash of steel, the terrible growl of wights piling on top of their prey. She clenched her teeth and forced herself to ignore it. She couldn't save them now. If she wanted to save anyone at all, she had to remain focused on her singular target. Another gust of wind carried the fleeting sound of wings, and she glanced skyward. High above, two dragons tangled in a furious fight. She saw flickers of flame and heard the shriek of living flesh raked by undead claws. The dance of dragons was a symbol of hope and terror all at once. If Daenerys and Jon could keep the undead dragon at bay, perhaps there was still time. She pressed onward, creeping along a frozen ridge behind the outer walls. At last, she reached a vantage point overlooking a lower courtyard. Her breath caught. Down in that courtyard, wights milled about in throngs, but in the center stood a presence more terrifying than any of them. Tall, regal in a macabre way, clad in black armor etched with swirling patterns of frost, the Night King surveyed the chaos. His eyes, aglow with an icy, ancient magic, seemed to pierce the darkness. Around him, White Walkers stood guard, silent as statues. He turned his head slowly, as if sensing something in the night. For a moment, Arya felt those glacial eyes might be looking directly at her. Her pulse thudded. He had not yet gone to the Godwood. Perhaps the final confrontation had not happened yet, or maybe he was orchestrating the battlefield to his liking. That was his mistake, she thought. If he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike at Bran, then she might have the element of surprise. She swallowed, the dryness in her throat painful. This was a risk beyond measure. But she had come for exactly this chance. Edging along the ridge, she sought a pathway to the courtyard. She spotted a half-collapsed archway leading into a labyrinth of half-finished corridors, remnants of expansions never completed. If she could navigate that maze, she might emerge behind the Night King's guard. She had trained for such infiltration, to be as silent as a phantom in the dark. Yet doubt assailed her. Could she really kill him here, surrounded by White Walkers? The memory of her victory against one of them gave her a sliver of confidence. She remembered how the Valyrian steel had met the icy blade, how it had shattered the White Walker's weapon like brittle glass, and how a single thrust had obliterated the creature. But the Night King was more powerful than any of his lieutenants. He was the root of this horror, the reason the dead walked. If he fell, the Whites might crumple like marionettes with their strings cut. Or perhaps some new atrocity would unfold. Regardless, she had no choice but to try. She eased her way down, pressing her body close to the cold stone. The roar of battle receded slightly as she entered the corridor. Each step came with care, her muscles taut, her senses honed. The temperature dropped further, as if even the wind refused to blow within these ancient walls. She heard the scuttling of rats or some other vermin that found refuge in these secret spaces. In her mind, she recalled all the times she had crawled through hidden passages in Harrenhal or slunk through the bowels of the House of Black and White. She reminded herself that fear was the mind killer. She could own her fear, but she would not let it chain her. The corridor opened into a series of connecting hallways, mostly deserted. She noticed frozen corpses slumped against the walls, the remains of men who had tried to find shelter here only to be cornered and slaughtered. Her stomach lurched at the sight of their wide, unseeing eyes. She forced herself onward, treading lightly over fallen weapons, broken shields, splatters of crimson frozen into the stone. At last, she emerged behind a collapsed pillar that overlooked the courtyard. The vantage was perfect. She could see the Night King more clearly now. He stood near what must have once been a training ground, motionless, cold authority radiating from him. 2 White Walkers remained by his side, each armed with their dreaded ice-forged blades. White scurried to and fro, forming a perimeter. She counted maybe 24 of them in the immediate area. Not impossible numbers, but one cry, one alarm, and she would be overwhelmed. She had to strike silently and true. Her breath misted in the air. She fought to steady her trembling hands. She thought of her family, of Sansa, so strong and yet so vulnerable if the tide of the dead broke through. Of Jon, who carried the burdens of kingship and prophecy on his shoulders. Of Bran, waiting in the Godwood with the knowledge of everything that had ever been. They all depended on her success. A new clarity washed over her, a sense of purpose. She could not fail. Slowly, she tested her dagger's grip. This was the same blade that had once threatened Bran's life, back when chaos had first found its way into their home. Now it had come full circle. The dagger was destined for a greater purpose, to end the greatest threat the living had ever known. She readied herself, quieted her breath, and began to creep along the edge of the rubble, circling toward the Night King's flank. The shadows flickered in the light of scattered fires, the wind carried gusts of snow that briefly obscured her from 6. Every step felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. One misstep and she would plummet. The Night King stirred. He raised his head as though listening for something far off. A chill of dread lanced through her. She pressed her body behind a toppled column, heart pounding like a trapped bird. Seconds passed in excruciating silence. Then one of the White Walkers stepped forward, scanning the darkness. Her vision tunneled. The walker's glowing eyes passed over her hiding place. She had to clamp her teeth to keep from gasping. Only when it turned away did she allow herself the faintest breath of relief. Somehow she edged closer. She was nearly within a stone's throw of the Night King, close enough to see the intricate patterns of frost on his crown like horns of ice, close enough to see each breath fogging in the air. His expression was devoid of pity, of warmth, of anything remotely human. He was a being forged of ancient wrath, a vengeance upon the realms of men. Arya knew she had to take her shot soon. The chaos of battle could shift at any moment and he would vanish or move on. Or he would sense her presence and all would be lost. But how to get past the White Walkers and the Whites? She glanced at the rubble scattered around, the remains of shattered walls. If she could cause a distraction, maybe draw them away, she could dart in. But she feared alerting the Night King. Then again, if she did nothing, she couldn't close the final gap. She reached down, found a small chunk of stone. She aimed for a far corner of the courtyard and hurled it with all her might. The stone clattered loudly against the remains of a broken wagon. Instantly, every undead head snapped in that direction, eyes glowing with malevolent curiosity. Arya held her breath, pressing herself deeper into her corner. The White Walkers drifted forward. The Whites followed, forming a ragged line. The Night King tilted his head as if mildly intrigued, but he held his ground. Now, this was her moment. Summoning every shred of courage and skill, Arya darted from her hiding place, weaving low behind toppled debris. Each footstep felt agonizingly loud in her own ears, but the swirling winds and the sound of scattered fighting masked her approach. She closed in on him, heart hammering, the dagger clutched tight. She had to quell the tremor in her hand. This had to be a perfect strike, one blow to end him before he even registered her presence. She was so close. She could see the texture of his armor, the faint swirl of icy vapor around him. One last step and the blade could plunge into his back. Then everything would be over. Her lips parted in silent anticipation. She rose, dagger poised, her training flooding her muscles with memory. In Bravos, she had learned to strike without warning, to be the whisper of death upon the wind. That was when he turned, as though he had always known she was there. Their eyes locked for a single heartbeat. She saw the infinite cold behind his gaze, the ancient hatred older than any mortal memory. The moment stretched impossibly long, as if time itself froze in awe of this meeting. Arya reacted with pure reflex. She twisted her body, her arms snapping forward in a deadly arc. The dagger aimed for his chest, for the spot where rumors claimed the Dragoglass shard had once been driven. She poured all her fury, all her loss, all her love for her family into that thrust. The Night King raised his arm, unnatural speed turning him into a blur. His frosted blade blocked hers with a chilling clang. Sparks flew. A shard of ice chipped away. She staggered, but she had been trained to fight in tight quarters, to shift her weight in a heartbeat. She dropped the dagger from one hand to the other, a fluid motion perfected in the dusty halls of the House of Black and White. She reversed her grip and lunged again, aiming below his raised guard. Her heart soared with the fleeting surge of triumph. Valyrian steel met the Night King's armor. For a terrifying moment, she feared it would glance off, that it would fail. But the metal bit true, punching through the icy surface. She felt a dreadful vibration run through her arm. The Night King recoiled, his mouth opening in a silent snarl, blue eyes blazing. A spiderweb of cracks radiated from the point of impact. Arya gasped, half in disbelief, half in exhilaration. At that instant, one of the White Walkers noticed her. He let out a shriek of alarm, high and shrill, echoing through the courtyard. The Whites spun around, but Arya pressed on, her blade sinking deeper. The cracks spread and the Night King's form began to shudder. She heard the distant roar of a dragon overhead, as if the world itself was reacting to this impossible event. In that second, she glimpsed a flash of fear, or was it rage, in the Night King's inhuman eyes. Then he shattered. With a sound like 1,000 icicles snapping at once, his body fragmented into shimmering shards of frost. A gust of wind scattered them, and where he had stood, there was only a swirl of snow dancing in the moonlight. Arya stood panting, her face flecked with tiny droplets of melted ice. Her dagger, still clenched in her trembling hand, glistened with cold condensation. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Every White Walker froze, their eyes going wide. Then, as if an invisible cord had been cut, they exploded into shards as well, collapsing into fine crystals of ice. One by one, the Whites collapsed to the ground, lifeless corpses once more. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sigh of the wind. Arya could hardly believe it. She had done it, slain the Night King before he could even reach Bran. The repercussions of this act rippled across the battlefield in an instant. The entire undead host, once unstoppable, now lay inert. She sucked in a breath that tasted like salvation and shock all at once. Slowly, she lowered her dagger, her knees threatening to buckle beneath her. Shouts rose from across the battlefield. Confusion, disbelief, then a rising surge of hope. The living saw their undead foes drop like puppets with their strings severed. Men who had been on the brink of despair now cried out in triumph. A wave of amazement flooded Winterfell's ramparts. For countless nights they had feared the unstoppable approach of the Night King. And now, in a single stroke, it was over. Arya allowed herself a moment to sink to her knees, breathing heavily. She had done what she set out to do, but the enormity of it threatened to overwhelm her. She forced herself to her feet. There was so much to do. Survivors to rescue, wounded to tend, bodies to count. And her family, she needed to make sure her family was safe. The dagger felt heavier than ever in her hand, as though it carried the weight of a world saved. A group of men-at-arms stumbled into the courtyard, eyes wide at the sight of her. They looked to the piles of dead wights, the scattering of frost and ice that marked where the White Walkers had once stood. Their gazes darted to the shattered remains of the Night King's armor, a faint glint among the rubble. Slowly, realization dawned on them. One man fell to his knees, murmuring a prayer of thanks. Another let out a ragged cheer. Arya, catching her breath, offered them a grim nod. She was no queen, no highborn lady in their eyes, but in this moment, she was a hero. Yet she felt no elation, only a profound weariness. The dead were gone, but the losses were not undone. Sorrow had visited this castle, left its scars, and many good people had perished. What she had done would not revive them, but it had spared countless others from the same fate. She could live with that. She made her way through the courtyard, ignoring the stares, the exclamations of awe. She climbed over collapsed beams and drifted into the corridors, the dagger still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Her mind reeled with questions. What now? Had she changed the shape of history so completely that the wars of men would never be the same? The living had been unified by the threat of the dead. With that threat gone, how long would unity last? She pushed those thoughts aside, one crisis at a time. For tonight, at least, they had won an impossible victory. She turned a corner and came upon Jon Snow, breathing hard, his eyes wild. He held Longclaw in a white-knuckled grip. Blood smeared his cheek, and the front of his armor was scored with fresh scratches. He looked around, seeing the piles of inert corpses. He met Arya's eyes, confusion etched into his features, followed swiftly by astonished relief. "Arya?" he whispered, as if he could scarcely believe she was there. What happened?" She swallowed, her mouth painfully dry. She lifted the dagger slightly, showing him the blade. "It's done," she said softly, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "The Night King is gone." Jon stared at her as though he needed time to parse those words. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached out and gripped her shoulder. "Gods," he breathed. "How?" For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight with a welter of emotion, relief, grief, disbelief. Finally, she rasped, "I found him. He never reached Bran. I ended it." Jon swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to the courtyard, to the endless drifts of unmoving whites. Then, in a rush of gratitude and something like awe, he pulled Arya into a fierce embrace. She felt the warmth of his body against her cold limbs, felt the tremor in his arms as he held her. She let her cheek rest against his shoulder for a moment, breathing in the smell of sweat and blood and the faint tang of dragon scales that always clung to him. It was so much to take in, the sudden shift from a doomed war to a miraculous victory. "You're bleeding," she said at last, noticing the slick red on his armor. He grimaced, glancing down. "Not mine, I think," he muttered. He released her, stepping back to look at her properly. "Are you all right?" She hesitated. Was she? The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her limbs heavy. Her head swam with lingering terror. But she nodded slowly. "I will be. We have to find Bran," Jon said, glancing toward the inner keep. "And Daenerys. The others. Make sure everyone knows. The dead are," he caught himself as if he could scarcely trust the words. "They're truly gone." Arya nodded. "Yes." She glanced at the corridor behind her. "I'm coming with you." They set off together, guiding each other through the half-lit maze of broken halls, stepping over corpses that no longer stirred. Occasionally, they encountered a stray wight, now entirely lifeless. The castle was eerily quiet, punctuated only by distant shouts of the living, men calling out for loved ones, searching for survivors. The dread had lifted, replaced by a collective bewilderment. In the courtyard, torches flickered on scenes of devastation, but also on men weeping tears of astonished joy. They found Bran in the Godwood. He sat by the heart tree, eyes distant, a faint trace of surprise in his usually impassive features. Sansa was there too, holding a torch, her face streaked with tears. The wind rustled the red leaves overhead like the whispers of old gods. When Jon and Arya stepped into the clearing, Sansa rushed forward, relief warring with 1,000 questions in her eyes. "Arya, Jon," she gasped. Are they truly gone?" Arya drew a shaky breath. "The Night King is no more," she said, her voice carrying in the stillness. "His army fell with him." Bran's pale gaze settled on Arya. He nodded once, the faintest sign of emotion curling the corner of his mouth. You changed the course, he murmured, his voice soft as the wind. He never reached me. You stopped him. Arya met his gaze. She didn't need to ask how he knew or what else he had seen. She only felt an immense weight lift from her shoulders. She had worried she might have broken some delicate future or tampered with forces beyond comprehension. But that was a worry for another day. For now, the living remained alive, and the dead had returned to rest. The night stretched on as survivors trickled in. Brienne, bruised and battered but alive, led a small contingent of knights into the Godswood. Tormund's booming laughter echoed through the trees as he realized the undead threat was finished. Davos limped in, cradling a wounded arm but wearing a weary grin. Each new arrival sparked a fresh wave of disbelief and cautious celebration. They found Daenerys near the main gate, supporting a limping Jorah Mormont, both of them looking stunned by the abrupt end to the horrors. Torches were lit, bonfires sparked, and a ragged cheer rose among the defenders. In the sudden rush of relief, tears mixed with laughter. Men slumped to the ground to catch their breaths. Women sobbed into each other's arms. Children emerged from hiding to look in wide-eyed wonder at the still forms of the dead. The cost was steep, but the victory was real and absolute. Amid the swirling aftermath, Arya found a moment alone. She stood by a broken section of wall, gazing at the field beyond Winterfell. Dawn's first light touched the horizon, staining the sky a pale gray. The stars were fading, and with them the nightmares. She still clutched the dagger, unwilling to part with it just yet. In the distance, wisps of smoke rose from funeral pyres hastily built to honor the fallen. She felt a deep ache in her chest for those who would never see the new day. Jon came to stand beside her. He didn't speak at first, just looked out over the same vista. At length, he said, "I still can't believe it's over." She nodded, not taking her eyes off the horizon. "Neither can I." Jon ran a hand through his tangled hair. "We were prepared to die tonight, or at least fight until there was nothing left. But you ended it in a single blow." Arya felt a twist in her gut. "I did what I had to do. If I hadn't..." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. They both knew how close they'd come to annihilation. Jon placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you. We all are. You've saved countless lives." She swallowed, the praise making her uncomfortable. "My father once told me, in winter we must protect one another. We must stand side by side, supporting each other, so that none may fall. Tonight, I did what I could." Jon looked at her, his expression bittersweet. Eddard Stark would be proud. Arya felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away, refusing to cry. Instead, she looked to the dawn. "What do we do now?" He sighed, the weight of a different kind of responsibility settling over him. "There's still Cersei," he said quietly, "and the Iron Throne, and a kingdom that needs rebuilding. But that can wait a day or two. For now, let's honor the dead and help the living." Arya nodded, relieved that she wouldn't have to shoulder another battle immediately. She had never cared for the politics and maneuverings of courts and crowns. She had cared about survival, about keeping her family safe. Tonight, she had done just that. "Go be with Sansa, Bran," Jon said. "They need to see you, know you're safe." She offered him a faint smile. "I will." "You?" He glanced at the battered fortress behind them. "I have many wounded to see to, and Daenerys. She lost so many of her people. She'll need help as well." Arya reached out and squeezed Jon's hand briefly. Then she turned, heading back toward the keep, leaving him to his thoughts. Her footsteps were slow, her limbs protesting every movement. Yet she felt a strange lightness in her heart. She had faced the greatest nightmare in the history of Westeros and emerged victorious. As the sun rose higher, Winterfell stirred with renewed life. Repairs began, and the living carried away the dead. Priests gave last rites, and silent tears were shed for the brave who fell. Somewhere amid the hustle, a group of northern lords began to gather around Sansa and Bran, no doubt wanting to plan for the future that was suddenly theirs to shape. Soldiers from the Vale and the Riverlands recounted stories of the battle in hushed tones. their eyes shining with the wonder of survival against impossible odds. Arya found Gendry in a corner of the courtyard, helping move debris. He looked up, sweat streaking his face, his muscles taut with the effort. Relief flooded his features when he saw her approach. He dropped the broken beam he was carrying and quickly crossed the space between them. "You're alive," he breathed, as though he'd been harboring doubts. He reached out to place a hand on her shoulder, then stopped, uncertain. She spared him a faint grin and nodded. "I'm alive," she confirmed. "And so are you." He let out a shaky laugh. "I thought we were done for." Then the whites just dropped, like someone blew out a candle. "Word is, the Night King is gone." She inclined her head. "It was my dagger that did it." Gendry stared at her in awe, then quickly checked himself. "I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been unstoppable." "I'm just, my gods, I don't even know what to say." She could sense the flood of emotions behind his voice. Gratitude, relief, admiration. She simply nodded. "Words aren't always necessary. There's work to do. Let's help clean up the pieces." They spent the next hours, though it felt like days, tending to the aftermath. Arya pitched in where she could, her exhaustion battled by sheer will. She helped carry the wounded to the Great Hall, which had been converted into a makeshift infirmary. She offered water to soldiers who had fought alongside her. Men who looked at her now as though she was some kind of legend. Felt surreal. She had never sought glory, never wanted renown. She only wanted to keep her family from harm. But if people needed something to believe in, she was content to let them think of her as a living weapon for the North. In quiet moments, she sought Sansa, who was coordinating relief efforts, delegating tasks with the calm efficiency she had honed as Lady of Winterfell. Their eyes met across the chaos, and Sansa offered Arya a grateful smile, her posture relaxing for just a heartbeat before she returned to her duties. It was an unspoken bond between them, sisters united by a cause far greater than any petty quarrels of the past. At midday, she finally found a chance to rest. She perched on a broken piece of wall near the remains of an old tower. Around her, the smoke from funeral pyres hung in the cold air. The sun offered a feeble warmth, but it was enough to keep the worst of the chill at bay. She let the dagger rest across her lap, studying the Valyrian steel as the light glinted off its rippled pattern. It had ended so many threats, and now it had ended the greatest of all. "What's next for you?" came a soft voice. She turned to see Bran wheeling himself toward her, his expression distant but curious. Arya shrugged, glancing at the dagger. "I'm still processing. I suppose I'll stay here for a while, help rebuild." Bran studied her with unsettling calm. "You've changed the path of many things. The lines of fate have altered, but the future remains unwritten. No one sees all ends." She sighed. "I'm not looking for prophecy. I've had enough of old legends and ancient evils." Bran dipped his head in a faint nod. "And yet you are a legend now, Arya. The girl who killed death itself." She didn't know how to respond. The notion made her skin crawl. She didn't want to be worshipped or feared. She only wanted to be free, to choose her own path. And maybe, in time, to see the wide expanse of the world beyond Westeros. For now, Winterfell needed her. That was enough. A shadow fell across them. Sansa approached, wearing a fur-lined cloak, her hair wind-blown. Her gaze flickered to Bran and Arya, softening at the sight of them together. "We're going to hold a council in the Great Hall," she said, "to decide how to proceed." Arya rose slowly, rolling her aching shoulders. "Lead the way." The three Stark children made their way back through the courtyard, passing groups of soldiers clearing debris and piling corpses for burning. The scale of the devastation weighed on Arya's heart, but each step was also a reminder of the lives spared, the realm saved from eternal night. She reminded herself that though victory was bought with sorrow, it was still victory. They had a future now, uncertain and full of challenges, but a future nonetheless. In the Great Hall, the leaders of the remaining forces had gathered around a long table, makeshift though it was. Daenerys sat near the head, her expression weary, her eyes rimmed with red. Tyrion stood at her side, offering quiet counsel. Grey Worm, badly injured, leaned on a crutch, but his face remained stoic. Ser Davos, Tormund, Brienne, Gendry, and others were scattered around, too many names and faces to account for in the swirl of exhaustion. Sansa took her seat, shoulders squared, wearing her role as Lady of Winterfell with poise. Arya and Bran slipped in beside her. Jon paced near the fireplace, throwing occasional glances at Daenerys. The tension between them was palpable. So much had happened in so little time, secrets revealed, alliances tested. Yet they were united for the moment, bound by the relief of having cheated death. Tyrion cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. I realize everyone is exhausted, so I'll be brief. We stand here in the wake of a miracle. The dead are gone and we are alive. That alone is reason for gratitude and, dare I say, celebration. But we cannot ignore the losses we've suffered. It will take time to rebuild Winterfell, to heal the wounds of the realm. My queen wishes to extend her deepest thanks to all of you who have fought and bled for this cause. Daenerys lifted a hand, gently cutting him off. She rose from her seat, wincing slightly as she moved. We have endured the long night together. The bravery shown here humbles me. And we owe our lives to one among us who struck the final blow. Her gaze swept the hall, coming to rest on Arya. Arya Stark, she said, her voice resonating in the hushed air, you ended the Night King before he could take everything from us. We will never forget that. A low murmur spread among those assembled, a ripple of agreement. Some bowed their heads toward Arya. She felt her cheeks burn and used to such public acknowledgement. Gritting her jaw, she gave a slight nod, her eyes flicking to Jon, who offered her a supportive smile. Daenerys continued, yet now we face the future. Cersei still sits on the Iron Throne and the Seven Kingdoms remain divided. I know many of you followed me north not for conquest, but to defeat the dead. That threat is gone. But I have not abandoned my claim. There it was, the pivot from survival to politics, as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. Arya felt her muscles tense. She saw Sansa's jaw tighten, a steely gleam in her eyes. The tension flared again in the hall. A single night of united purpose could not erase old wounds and ambitions. Jon cleared his throat. We agreed to unite against the dead first. That's done. Now we must decide how to handle the living. The North has bled enough. Tormund let out a snort. Aye, we have. If not for the Dragon Queen's forces and the Southern Lords, we might never have held out. But that doesn't mean we're bending the knee. Daenerys' gaze flicked to Tormund, then to Sansa. I do not ask for unquestioning fealty. I ask for cooperation. With the Night King defeated, I'm prepared to discuss a new arrangement, perhaps one that respects the independence of the North while recognizing my authority over the rest of the realm. She paused, letting the words sink in. This is no time for more bloodshed. The living must remain united, or all we fought for could be lost to strife. A thoughtful hush settled. Tyrion surveyed the room, measuring the mood. We could negotiate terms. The realm has never faced such devastation. Food will be scarce. The roads are not safe. There's a great deal of work ahead to rebuild trust, to restore order. We can't do it alone. Sansa spoke, her voice calm yet firm. The North remembers its own. We have lost many. We must see to our people first. But we are not blind to reason. If Queen Daenerys is willing to let the North govern itself, then perhaps we can find a path forward. Daenerys inclined her head, a flicker of relief crossing her features. I am. And Jon Snow has my trust. If he believes the North should be free, I will not stand in the way as long as there is mutual respect between us all. Eyes darted between Daenerys and Jon, between Sansa and Tyrion. The hall teemed with cautious optimism. No one wanted another war, not after the horror they had just survived. Gradually, nods of agreement spread through the group. There would be details to hammer out, old loyalties to mend, but it was a beginning. Arya let out a silent breath. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, it seemed the living might find peace without more slaughter. She was not naive, she knew that the Game of Thrones was never truly gentle. But maybe, just maybe, the memory of this night would remind them all of what true darkness looked like, of how precious life was. The council continued, hashing out the basics of a post-war arrangement. Gendry was legitimized as a Baratheon and offered Storm's End. Tyrion spoke of distributing supplies among the war-ravaged areas. Davos pledged to gather resources from the Southern Lords who had remained neutral. Tormund promised the Free Folk would help rebuild the North if they were allowed to live freely beyond the Wall or wherever they chose. Brienne insisted on reorganizing the Knights to provide protection for traveling refugees. Bit by bit, a fragile tapestry of hope began to take shape. Through it all, Arya observed quietly, her mind drifting now and then. She felt a strange detachment, as though she stood outside herself, watching the forging of a new realm. A part of her yearned for the open road, for the thrill of discovery. But for the moment, her family needed her here. She would not abandon them in their time of rebuilding. When the council concluded, she slipped away, finding her old chamber. It was cold and dark, dust motes dancing in the thin beam of afternoon sunlight creeping through the narrow window. She eased onto the bed, setting the dagger on a small table. A wave of exhaustion crashed over her, as though her body only now realized it could rest. The memory of the Night King's final moment played behind her eyelids, the image of his ice-blue eyes shattering into 1,000 shimmering shards. She felt a ghostly shiver, but also an odd sense of solace. She didn't remember drifting off, but at some point, sleep claimed her. In her dreams, she ran through endless halls of black and white, faces flickering in and out of focus, a single name whispering through the corridors, Arya Stark. When she awoke, dusk was settling. She rose, ran a hand through her tangled hair, and made her way out to join the Night's Watch. Work was never done. Thus ended the longest night in living memory. The dawn that followed was uncertain, but it was a dawn free of the dead's shadow, thanks to the quiet, deadly courage of a girl who had once been no one. Now, in the hush of a northern evening, with funeral pyres still glowing faintly on the horizon, Arya Stark looked upon the future with cautious, resolute eyes. One chapter had closed, but she knew many more lay ahead. Still, for the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. She had defied fate, undone the darkest threat that had loomed over all creation. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it on her own terms, a wolf of the north and a master of her own destiny. Yet the days that followed brought no easy peace. The morning after the final destruction of the dead arrived pale and thin, a fragile dawn barely illuminating the horrors that still lingered. Though the sudden collapse of the Night King's army left countless survivors alive to see the sun, it also left behind the sobering wreckage of Winterfell and the wounded hearts of those who had lost friends and kin. Word spread rapidly across the north. Riders were sent out in all directions to inform distant keeps and hamlets that the Great War was ended, that the threat from beyond the wall was gone forever. Some families would hear the news with tears of gratitude, others with disbelief, and some with bitterness for the dead who could not be brought back. Arya stood in the courtyard once more, where heaps of rubble made the once proud fortress appear as though it had been gnawed upon by giants. The air was calmer than it had been through the fierce night. Workers dragged broken wagons and toppled beams aside, piling them near the walls to be sorted for salvage or firewood. A sense of disbelief still hung over every action. Men and women wore the vacant expressions of those who had braced themselves for oblivion, only to be spared at the final moment. They moved slowly, as if worried the dead might rise again once their backs were turned. Even the children, glimpsed darting between clusters of exhausted soldiers, seemed subdued, speaking in hushed voices that carried a ripple of shock. Arya passed them like a shadow, her own mind brimming with uncertainties. She did not flaunt her victory, nor did she try to hide from the recognition in the eyes of others. The memory of the Night King's shattered form played through her thoughts in brief, sudden flashes. Sometimes she felt as though she could still see him there in the courtyard, a silent specter of ice. The dagger at her belt had grown to feel like part of her own body, an extension of her arm rather than a separate weapon. She often ran her thumb across the hilt, as though checking that it remained real. Winterfell needed so much attention in the wake of the devastation. Grave faces hovered over the wounded in the Great Hall and in smaller rooms hastily converted to infirmaries. The battle had been shorter than any of them expected. When the Whites fell, it was as though half a war was left unfought, but the initial onslaught had been long enough to maim and kill countless souls. As the castle stabilized, streams of battered fighters arrived from the outskirts, leading more wounded, telling stories of horrors they'd seen. The hush that enveloped them was not the hush of final defeat, but that of stunned victory, as though they waited for someone to shout that a fresh army of the dead loomed over the horizon. But that shout never came. On the morning of the second day, a thick frost coated the courtyard, turning the piles of corpses into grotesque monuments to what had almost been the end of humankind. Huge pyres were erected beyond the walls, their smoke drifting like black phantoms toward the iron-gray sky. Arya watched as men she recognized from her childhood, stable hands and field workers, carried the remains of neighbors and friends onto the stacked wood. She recognized families huddled together, their faces reddened by cold and weeping. Some survivors cast meaningful looks her way, yet none approached her. Perhaps they feared her, in awe of the girl who had killed death itself. Perhaps they simply sensed she had no ready words to give. She found Sansa in the library, seated in a pool of wan morning light that struggled through the narrow windows. A brazier crackled near her, though the library was still chill enough for visible breath. Parchments littered the table, maps, rosters, inventory lists. Sansa was bent over them, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, quill in hand. She looked up when Arya entered, offering the barest smile. "They say thousands died out on the field," Sansa said quietly, "and hundreds more inside these walls. Some we don't even have names for yet. We'll do what we can for them and their families." Arya took a seat across from her, glancing at the lists. "We'll rebuild." Sansa's face glowed with a calm, determined acceptance. "Yes, though it's so much. The North is strong, but it's also battered. If word of our victory travels fast, there may be lords from all over who bring help or at least come to see what truly happened. And then there's Cersei." Arya kept her expression neutral. The thought of a southern queen on the Iron Throne, one who had refused to lend any real aid against the dead, soured her mood. "Let her scheme," Arya murmured, "as she does. The North's immediate troubles aren't hers to solve." They were both quiet for a moment. Then Sansa tapped her quill against the table. "Daenerys has said she'll grant the North its independence. But there will be more negotiations, Tyrion, Davos, the others. They've been talking to me, to Jon, even to Bran at times. I think the Queen wants to make good on her word, but it'll cost her, especially in the South. Her advisors might try to dissuade her once she sees the shape of the realm. Even so, if we stand united, we might secure lasting freedom for the North." Arya eyed her sister's tired features. "You're not satisfied." Sansa turned her gaze to a crack in the table's wood. "It's not that. It's we've bled so much. We deserve what we were promised. Daenerys wants the Iron Throne, and if we give her no reason to break her word, I believe we can avoid another war. Jon stands with her. She'll either keep her vow or risk turning him into an enemy. And she won't want that." "Jon doesn't want a war," Arya said. "He didn't want war even before we lost so many. I think he'd do anything to spare the North more suffering." Sansa's expression grew thoughtful. "He loves the North, but he also feels some loyalty to Daenerys. And the truth about his parentage isn't forgotten. Tyrion knows, I know, you know, and some others suspect. Jon may not push the claim, but it could be used against the Queen by those who see a different future for the realm." Arya let out a short breath. "Too many games. After everything, after the dead nearly took us all, the lords are still determined to play with crowns." Sansa's lips curved in a faint, humorless smile. "It's always that way. Even the greatest threat to humanity couldn't erase ambition in men's hearts. But we've gained time at least. And time might be our only ally for the moment." Arya glanced away, her mind drifting to the day's upcoming tasks. More bodies would be burned, more wounded seen to. Repairs had to be planned. "If you need help," she said softly, "tell me. I'm not much for managing lists, but whatever else." Sansa stretched out a hand to squeeze Arya's. They shared a look of sisterly understanding. "We'll need every bit of help," Sansa replied. "Thank you." They parted quietly, each lost in thought. Arya took a roundabout path through the corridors, occasionally pausing to offer a hand to anyone struggling with a heavy load. Most of them insisted they could handle it, practically tripping over themselves in respectful deferral to her. That awkward reverence still gave Arya an odd twist in her gut, but she tried to accept it with dignity. She was no longer the little girl brandishing a wooden sword in the courtyards to be teased or scolded. Now, many considered her a figure almost beyond mortal measure, the slayer of the Night King. Yet she still felt like herself, just Arya, a wolf looking for the best way to protect her pack. She found Gendry again near the forges, where the clang of metal rang out as blacksmiths attempted to salvage broken weapons. Dragon's teeth, men called the shattered Valyrian steel that they'd scrounged from the Whites or from disintegrated White Walkers. In truth, there was little left to gather. Gendry was overseeing a few blacksmiths who were sorting through an array of battered blades and ruined arrowheads, hoping to reforge them into something useful. When Arya approached, Gendry paused what he was doing, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his gloved hand. His face lit up, if only slightly, upon seeing her. "We're trying to melt down what's left of the broken dragoglass and see if it's salvageable for arrowheads. Not sure if it matters as much now, but we might as well do something with it. No sense in letting it lie around useless." Arya stepped closer, her eyes on the racks of twisted metal. "That's good. We'll need every resource we can get, with so many swords broken and too few blacksmiths left." Gendry's gaze flicked to her belt, noticing the dagger she still carried. "You're keeping that close." She nodded. "I might never let it out of my sight." A half-smile tugged at Gendry's lips. "I can't say I blame you." He took a moment to look at her more closely, noting the tightness around her eyes. Have you slept enough? Arya shrugged. A bit. More than I expected, to be honest. My mind is restless, but my body forces me to rest whenever I can. Gendry reached out as though to take her hand, then hesitated, remembering her discomfort with too much sentiment. He turned the motion into a half-wave. Well, if you need something, ask. I'll be here until sundown, then I might help with the pyres again. She stayed a moment longer, listening to the ringing hammers and the hiss of the forge. It reminded her of when she was a child watching Gendry work metal in Harrenhal, both of them forced to serve Tywin Lannister's needs. Then she'd been no one important, just a girl disguised as a boy trying to survive day to day. And Gendry had been nothing more than an apprentice blacksmith, ignorant of his Baratheon blood. Now everything had changed. She left him to his work and wound her way back to the courtyard, passing a group of people who had begun singing a low, mournful song in honor of the dead. Their voices rose in the crisp air, merging with the swirl of snow. Every step Arya took brought reminders of the cost of this victory: blood-stained cobblestones, shattered timbers, a battered shield leaning against a cracked wall. And yet it could have been infinitely worse. That evening, the sky turned bruised purple and deep blue, streaked with the final glow of a weak sunset. Arya gathered with the rest of the survivors outside the castle walls where the pyres waited. Lines of unlit torches ran across the snowy field. The bodies of fallen Northerners, Vale Knights, Unsullied, Dothraki, and countless others had been sorted the best they could, but many remained unknown. The flickering light of braziers revealed an ocean of motionless forms laid out with as much dignity as possible. Jon and Daenerys stood near the front of the assembly, speaking quietly with the lords, the knights, and leaders of various units. Bran sat in his wheeled chair nearby, eyes half-lidded as though listening to something beyond the realm of mortal hearing. Sansa stood with the lords of the north, her face as composed as she could make it, though Arya could sense the sorrow beneath her calm facade. Tyrion was there too, looking drawn and pale, and Ser Davos hovered behind him, arms folded across his chest. The flames were lit with a torch handed from Daenerys and Jon to those who had lost loved ones. The cold wind caught the first licks of fire, spurring them onward. Arya felt the blast of heat against her cheeks. For a time, no one spoke, but the crackle of burning wood and the muffled sobs of some overwhelmed the silence. Smoke rose in wavering columns, blotting out the stars. She stood beside her siblings, feeling that intangible bond that was all the more precious for having survived the night of the dead. Tears rimmed Sansa's eyes, and Arya placed a hand on her sister's shoulder in a rare gesture of open comfort. Sansa reached up and squeezed her fingers, grateful. Jon caught Arya's gaze from a few feet away and offered her a nod that spoke volumes of shared grief and relief. Bran simply observed, though his expression suggested a remote sorrow that encompassed more than just the present moment. When dawn broke the next day, the final remains of the pyres had cooled into black heaps. Soot stained the snow in ugly patches. Crows circled overhead, sometimes landing to scavenge scraps. Yet the sky was clear of the gloom that had pressed down on them for so many days. They had time, at least, to begin the healing. It was on this morning that Daenerys called for a gathering in the Great Hall once again. The temperature inside was only marginally warmer than outside, but the walls shielded them from the biting wind. The tables remained cleared, used mainly for maps and documents these days, and the floor had been swept clean of debris and blood. Small braziers glowed around the hall, but the atmosphere was heavy. Everyone was exhausted and uncertain about what came next. Arya slipped in quietly, taking a spot near the back, content to watch. She saw Sansa, Jon, and Daenerys at the focal point, with Tyrion and Ser Davos close by. Grey Worm was present as well, leaning on his staff. The North's banners hung tattered from the walls. Daenerys raised her voice to address the room. "We have done what we came here to do. The Night King is no more, and his army will never rise again. We owe our lives to the bravery of every soldier who fought here, and especially to Arya Stark, who struck the fatal blow." A ripple of acknowledgement passed through the crowd, and several heads turned to look at Arya. She kept her face unreadable, her posture tense. She noted that Daenerys did not flourish or dramatize Arya's deed further, as if understanding that doing so might only deepen Arya's discomfort. The Queen continued, "I remain sworn to my goal of taking the Iron Throne in King's Landing. However, in light of these events and the promises made, I will not ask the North to march with me again unless they wish to. The North has lost enough. I have lost many men of my own, but I will continue south with my forces. If any among you choose to join me, I will be grateful. But the choice is yours." There was a tense pause. Sansa stepped forward, her voice steady. "Queen Daenerys, the North is thankful for your help. We remember that you brought your dragons, your armies, to stand against the dead. As promised, we ask only that you respect our independence. Let the North govern itself and see to its own future. Daenerys inclined her head. As I have said, I agree. Murmurs spread among the northern lords. Some looked uneasy, as if they expected trickery. Others seemed relieved. Tyrion cleared his throat. An alliance between the North and the Queen could still benefit us all. Trade routes, mutual defense pacts, these are things to consider. But for now, perhaps a formal statement from both sides will suffice to keep the peace until the Queen is settled on the Iron Throne. Sansa nodded, glancing at Jon. Jon took a small step forward, speaking in that quiet, thoughtful tone of his. The North will stand by its own laws and see to its own defenses, but we won't deny the reality that our alliances could strengthen the realm as a whole. We all bled together against the dead. It would be a shame to revert to old grudges too soon. Tormund let out a snort, arms folded over his broad chest. If there's to be no more talk of kneeling and bending, the free folk might stay in the North. We've no interest in who sits on what throne down south. Daenerys regarded Tormund with a mixture of respect and weariness. The free folk are free to choose, as they always have been, so long as they do not threaten my people or my allies. Agreed, Tormund said, giving her a curt nod. Quietly, the discussion moved on to details, how to coordinate travel where Daenerys's forces would replenish supplies, the question of whether the Vale would stay or return with her. All the while, Arya's eyes flicked around the room, reading the tension in subtle shifts of posture, the flickers of expression on Tyrion's face, the set of Sansa's jaw. Jon radiated a desire to keep everyone on good terms, while Daenerys, for all her queenly composure, carried a certain tightness in her shoulders that betrayed concern over what awaited her in King's Landing. When the meeting ended, the participants drifted into smaller knots of conversation. Sansa and Tyrion huddled near a side table, quietly discussing the formal documentation of the North's independence. Davos spoke with Grey Worm, each man exuding a blend of respect and guardedness. Daenerys murmured something to Jon that seemed laden with personal weight, then exited the hall, perhaps to see her dragons or check on her scattered people. Arya slipped away unnoticed, glad to be free of the politics that bound the others. Still, even as she crossed the threshold into the corridor, she felt the weight of expectations pressing on her. Men and women peered at her in passing, some with gratitude, others with a curious awe. The castle was rife with rumors that she had flown on a dragon's back to stab the Night King, that she was a sorceress from Braavos who'd traded her soul for power, that she was secretly half ghost, half woman. Arya ignored them all. There was work to do in a simpler, more direct sense. She found herself drifting toward the crypts, feeling an unspoken pull. Down the winding staircases she went, breath curling in the clammy air. The smell of old stone and dust enveloped her like a memory of childhood. Torches flickered in wall sconces, revealing the solemn faces of long-dead Starks carved in stone. Here rested her father, her mother, her brother Robb, and generations of ancestors whose names she knew only from stories. She paused before her father's statue. Eddard Stark's likeness was captured in cool stone, his face bearing that quiet, somber nobility she remembered so well. Arya let out a small, ragged sigh. Once in King's Landing, she had believed that avenging him was her only purpose. Now she had avenged him 100 times over, killed men who had wronged her family, slashed the throat of the traitorous Walder Frey, even ended the greatest threat that Westeros had ever known. Yet she could not shake the feeling that her father's words about duty and honor guided her still. "Father," she whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the crypt's hush. "We're safe now. The dead are gone. But there's so much left undone. The people up there. Some want to fight for more power, others want to hold what they have. Jon wants peace. Sansa wants security. She closed her eyes, feeling foolish talking to a statue. But her chest felt tight with emotions she couldn't voice anywhere else. "I just want to make sure none of us lose what we've won." She thought she could almost feel her father's reassuring presence, a memory of how he would place a warm hand on her shoulder, calling her his little girl, telling her how proud he was, even when she missed her lessons to shoot arrows or chase cats around the courtyard. The recollection made her eyes sting. "Arya?" came a soft voice behind her. She turned to see Bran's figure at the bottom of the crypt steps, his wheelchair casting a distorted shadow on the floor. His calm, nearly inscrutable expression gave him an otherworldly air in the flickering torchlight, as if the crypt's ghosts greeted him like an old friend. She shifted, feeling a blush of embarrassment at being caught in such a private moment. "Bran," she acknowledged, "didn't hear you come down." He rolled closer, the wheels echoing slightly against the stones. You must have been deep in thought. She studied him with careful eyes. Did you see something? Or just decide to come here? Bran's gaze flickered over her father's statue. I see many things, but mostly I remember. Even the crypts can't hide from the sight of the three-eyed raven. Sometimes I come down here to reflect, to watch ghosts of the past if I choose. It's all woven together. Arya had long since given up trying to fully understand the scope of Bran's abilities. Does it help? She asked in a quiet voice. Knowing how things used to be, or how they turned out differently in other times. He tilted his head, an enigmatic quality in his pale eyes. Sometimes, it doesn't always bring comfort, though. We Starks have always been tied to Winterfell, to the north, to the duty of guarding the realm against the cold and the darkness. You more than any of us have carried that duty in your own way. She let out a soft snort. I carried a knife that happened to kill a monster. It's nothing so grand. Bran's voice was gentle. You killed not just a monster, but the Night King himself, a being older than memory. You changed the future in one swift stroke. No one else could have done it that way. That's worth more than you admit. Arya looked down, feeling the weight of his words. She was not prone to vanity, but she couldn't deny what she'd done. She merely nodded. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the torches guttering softly. Then Arya asked, "What do you think happens now? Will Daenerys truly give us our independence and then sail away to deal with Cersei?" Bran seemed to withdraw inward as though sifting through visions. "She's sincere in her promise," he said at last. "Yet there are those around her who fear letting the North slip away sets a precedent. They want the entire realm whole under her rule. She will have to balance that desire against her own sense of honor and her trust in Jon. But Cersei remains the greatest threat in the south, with the Lannister forces and the Golden Company at her disposal." Arya exhaled, her breath forming a faint cloud in the chill air. "It's always something else," she murmured. "We never really get peace, do we?" "Not lasting peace," Bran said softly. "The game continues. Men and women with power will seek more of it. Sometimes they'll do good, sometimes ill. Our family stands at a crossroads, shaping the next era. You especially, Arya, carry a freedom none of us do. You roam outside the rules that bind Jon as a leader, or Sansa as the Lady of Winterfell, or me as the Three-Eyed Raven. You can move in ways that defy expectation." Arya considered that. In a sense, she had always known it. She was the girl who left home, who donned different faces, who lived on the streets of Bravos and learned to be no one. She had no real constraints except those she chose. "What do you suggest?" He gave her a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "I suggest you decide for yourself. You are free to remain in Winterfell, help in the rebuilding, keep watch for new threats. You are also free to journey across the sea, if that's what your heart desires, or to roam the Seven Kingdoms unburdened by titles. But whatever you do, you'll always be Arya Stark of Winterfell, the girl who killed the Night King. No path can take that away from you." Her throat tightened. She glanced again at her father's statue, feeling a mingled sorrow and pride. "I can't just leave everyone," she said quietly, yet she remembered the old ache to explore distant lands, see what lay beyond the horizon. It was the same yearning that once drew her to a ship's cabin in Bravos. Bran nodded. "No one said you must leave. Only that if you choose to, the door is open. The future is wide, and you've earned the right to shape your own destiny." They spoke little after that. Bran lingered in the crypts for a time, and Arya eventually returned to the world above, her thoughts swirling. She spent the day helping with small tasks, honing a sword for a soldier whose arm was in a sling, helping a young girl find her missing mother among the refugees, giving quiet pointers to a few who practiced archery amid the rubble. Everywhere she walked, men and women stood a little straighter when they saw her, though sometimes that made her want to slip back into the shadows. On the following morning, the sea of tents that had housed Daenerys' armies began to stir with renewed purpose. Wagons were loaded with what remained of the unsullied supplies, along with salvaged gear from the Dothraki who had survived. A few of the Queen's dragons swooped overhead, roosting on shattered towers. Arya could feel the rumble of their wing beats in her chest. The great beasts were no longer the terrifying legends they had once seemed. She had fought alongside them, but they still exuded an aura of untamed fury. Daenerys herself appeared in the courtyard by midday. She was wrapped in heavy furs, her silver hair braided and pinned back. Her posture was as proud as ever, but her eyes carried the burden of immense loss. Jorah Mormont's death had deeply pained her, so had the demise of many of her trusted warriors. Yet she wore her losses like armor, forging resolve out of grief. She beckoned to Arya when she saw her, and Arya approached with the same wariness she felt in the presence of any great ruler. Daenerys had never treated her unkindly, but there was a distance there, a sense that they existed in entirely different spheres. "Will you walk with me?" Daenerys asked. It was not quite a command, more of a polite request. Arya nodded, falling into step beside her. They traversed a section of the castle walls where the stones were still blackened from dragon fire. From that vantage, the fields beyond spread out in stark whiteness, where half-melted snow revealed patches of muddy ground. Pyres had been cleared to a distant corner, and groups of people were scouring the land for any leftover debris. Daenerys' voice was introspective. "We depart in 2 days' time. That's the decision. The roads to the south are treacherous and winter is still upon us, but we must move soon if we're to deal with Cersei before she gathers all of her strength." Arya looked at the swirling clouds overhead. "I imagine she's had time to fortify King's Landing. She might believe the living are weakened by the battle here." A faint smile touched Daenerys' mouth. "She would be right to believe that, but I have dragons still and enough unsullied to give her pause. The Golden Company might be formidable, but they've never faced a dragon in open war. Also, the living are resilient, it seems. We have proven that." Arya nodded, remembering the unstoppable wave of whites crumbling into dust. For all that had happened, humans remained capable of regrouping. "Do you think she'll surrender?" Daenerys' eyes flashed. "If I had hopes of that, I might be a fool. She will cling to power until someone pries it from her hands. Jon wishes to spare innocent lives, so we'll attempt a final negotiation if we can. But ultimately, I know what Cersei is. She won't yield." Arya listened to the resoluteness in the queen's tone. She recalled her own kill list from years past, the unwavering determination that had driven her onward. Daenerys had that same unwavering quality, though it burned for a throne, for the notion of restoring House Targaryen. Arya had never cared for such things, but she understood the power of a deeply held conviction. They walked in silence for a few steps. Then Daenerys said softly, "Will you come? You and your siblings? Jon has told me you might stay here in Winterfell to help rebuild, but if you wish to ride south, you'd be welcome. I know your skills. There might be a place for them in the days to come." Arya considered. Sansa will never leave the north for more than a short journey. She's the Lady of Winterfell, and I don't think she has any desire to step back into the southern viper's nest. Bran, he's the three-eyed raven now. His duties keep him here, mostly. And Jon is torn. He might want to accompany you, but he also can't leave his people in disarray. If the north truly becomes independent, they'll need a stable seat of power. She paused, feeling the crisp air on her face. "As for me, I haven't decided." Daenerys arched an eyebrow, regarding her with something like curiosity. "You helped save the world, in a sense. I would not deny you the freedom to choose your own path." Arya turned to face her. "What would I do in King's Landing, truly? I'm not a knight or a lord. I'm just Arya Stark. I'm not sure my talents are of much use in a siege." Daenerys' gaze was keen. "Don't underestimate your talents. If Cersei refuses peace, there will be bloodshed. Agents skilled in infiltration might be needed. You might have less scruple about certain actions than others if it means sparing an all-out massacre. Think on it." Arya held the queen's stare. There was a faint chill in Daenerys' words, an undercurrent that suggested she might be willing to end the war more quietly, perhaps with a knife in the dark, rather than raise the city with dragons if she had the chance. In another life, Arya would have seized that opportunity without hesitation, especially if Cersei was on her list. A part of her still remembered that name, Cersei Lannister, who had brought so much suffering to her family. But everything felt different now that the Night King was gone. She no longer burned with the same kind of vengeance. "I'll think on it," Arya said at last. "But no promises." Daenerys nodded. "Of course." They parted ways, leaving Arya to wander the walls on her own. She found a spot overlooking the training yards where broken dummies slumped in corners and newly recruited guards attempted to reorganize. Every so often, a patch of sunlight would reflect off someone's armor, sending a bright glint toward her. She felt restless, as though she had outgrown the shape of her life but didn't know what new shape to assume. The memory of Bran's words flitted through her mind, "You can move in ways that defy expectation." That night, she dreamt she was once again crossing the narrow sea to Braavos, her face changing with every blink of her eyes, yet always the same heart beating in her chest. She dreamt of dark corridors and whispers of the many-faced god. Then her dream shifted, and she stood on the ramparts of Winterfell, brandishing her dagger while an endless snowstorm stretched out before her, swirling with the ghosts of the dead. The dream left her unsettled, uncertain. Morning arrived in a haze of clouds and occasional sunlight. The castle bustled with new activity. Men readied horses, blacksmiths hammered out repairs to battered armor, and Daenerys' followers began packing up tents, supplies, and the last vestiges of the massive camp. The mood was subdued but determined, as if they all knew the next battle might define the fate of the South. Arya found Jon in the courtyard, watching as a few men tested their swords in a short spar. He wore his customary furs, his brow furrowed. When he saw Arya approaching, he dismissed the sparring men with a wave and turned to greet her. "You've heard, then?" he said, a slight question in his tone. She nodded. "You're leaving soon?" he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I haven't decided. Daenerys expects me to help lead her northern allies. But the truth is we have so few left. We lost so many good men. Most of them are in no condition to march again so soon. The north is in shambles. We'll need months to recover." Arya folded her arms, remembering how Jon used to ruffle her hair when she was small. "You can't please everyone," she said gently. "If you try, you'll tear yourself apart. What does your heart tell you?" His eyes were weary. "My heart tells me the north is my home and my duty. But I also gave my word to Daenerys, and she's lost so much. She might not be able to take King's Landing without help. Even if I can't bring a large force, I could still support her cause, at least politically. She deserves some backing after what she risked for us." Arya considered this. "Are you worried about leaving Sansa here alone?" "She won't be alone," Jon said. "Bran is here, and Tyrion has pledged to keep an open line of support if the North is indeed left to govern itself. Sansa is more than capable of handling matters. Truth be told, she might handle them better without me. I've never been much for politics. She's grown quite adept at it." Arya offered a faint smile. "She has. She's changed a lot since we were young. We all have." Jon drew a breath, his tone softening. "And you, Arya? What about you? Do you plan to stay here in Winterfell? Or do you mean to roam again?" She looked away, her gaze traveling across the half-ruined walls. "I don't know. Part of me wants to see new places, to travel the world and be free of all the duties and obligations. But I love this place. It's in my blood. And I want to stand by my family if they need me." Jon reached out and gripped her shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'll trust you to make the right choice. You've earned that more than anyone." A silence passed between them, filled with unspoken affection and respect. Then Jon let go, and they returned their attention to the swirl of activity in the courtyard. The next day brought final preparations for Daenerys' departure. Snow flurries danced in the air, and the courtyard echoed with the snorts of horses and the trudging steps of Unsullied readying to depart. A handful of knights from the Vale had volunteered to travel south, though most of their forces chose to remain in the north to guard against any future threats or to protect their own lands. Tyrion spent hours poring over route maps with Ser Davos and a few local guides, determining the safest road south given the lingering winter storms. Grey Worm, still healing from his injuries, assembled the Unsullied in neat ranks, their discipline unbroken despite all they had lost. The small handful of surviving Dothraki planned to ride ahead and scout. When the moment of departure arrived, Arya found herself standing on one of the walkways above the gates, looking down at the array of soldiers. Daenerys mounted a pale horse near the front, regal in her posture despite the swirl of snow. Her surviving dragon too, actually, Regal and Drogon, circled overhead. Regal bore scars from the undead Viserions' attacks, while Drogon carried memories of fierce battle. They roared as if bidding farewell to the north. Jon stood beside Daenerys, dressed for travel, Longclaw sheathed at his side. A cluster of northern men, those who had decided to follow him, stood further back, their heads bowed against the wind. Tormund decided to remain behind, leading his free folk deeper into the north. Gendry hovered near the fringes, uncertain whether to remain or go south to claim Storm's End. Arya could see the hesitation plain in his stance. She suspected he would soon set out for his father's old seat to forge a new legacy. Davos, shaking his head at the endless nature of war, also prepared to ride with them. Brienne had chosen to stay in Winterfell, partially to guard Sansa, partially because her oath to protect the Stark girls felt more pressing than the southern conflict. She had parted with Jaime Lannister some time ago. No one knew precisely where Jaime had gone. Some said he rode south alone, others that he had quietly left in the midst of the chaos to confront his sister. At length, the horns sounded, a long, echoing note in the cold air. Daenerys and her entourage began moving out, passing through the gates beneath Arya's vantage point. A hush fell, broken only by the crunch of hoofbeats and the clink of gear. Jon lifted his head to gaze up at the ramparts. His dark eyes found Arya's, and he raised a hand in a subtle farewell. She returned the gesture, heart-twisting with a mixture of pride and sadness. Then he was gone, disappearing down the road, swallowed by the swirl of snow. Winterfell felt emptier with their departure. The courtyard, once brimming with activity, now seemed hollow. Sansa emerged onto the walkway, coming to stand beside Arya, their cloaks snapping in the gusty wind. They watched until the last shapes vanished behind the winter haze. Sansa's voice was quiet. "He'll be all right." Arya nodded, though part of her worried. "He's always throwing himself into danger." "That's Jon," Sansa said, a hint of fondness mingled with exasperation. Then she looked at Arya. "Are you staying? At least for now?" Arya took a breath, the wind biting her cheeks. "I'll stay," she said. "Winterfell needs a few more hands." "You do too." And she paused, collecting her thoughts. "I'm not ready to leave yet, but someday when things are settled." Sansa offered a small smile that carried understanding. "You'll go on your adventures, see the world, and we'll still be here, your family, waiting if you decide to return." Arya returned her smile, touched by the acceptance in her sister's eyes. They turned and walked along the battlements, heading toward the central keep. In the days and weeks that followed, life in Winterfell settled into a new rhythm. The constant threat of the undead no longer loomed, allowing for the simpler tasks of refortifying walls, clearing rubble, and storing provisions for the remainder of winter. Sansa held court in the Great Hall, receiving visitors who came to confirm the rumors of the Night King's defeat and to pay respects to House Stark. Some brought token gifts of grain or salted fish, hoping for favor or alliances. Others simply wanted to gaze upon the castle where the Great War had ended. Bran spent much of his time either in quiet contemplation or lending advice to Sansa. He had visions of events happening far away, including glimpses of Daenerys' march south, but he rarely volunteered details unless they mattered to the North's security. Sansa took this in stride, trusting him to speak up if danger threatened. She continued to hone her own leadership skills, relying on a combination of courtesy and firmness that won respect from the local lords. Arya, meanwhile, divided her time between practical tasks, training a few young men and women in the art of stealth, patrolling the grounds at night to ensure no pockets of undead had somehow been overlooked, and private reflection. Sometimes she took long rides beyond the castle walls, weaving through the snowy forests. She savored the quiet hush of the trees, the subtle crack of ice under her horse's hooves. It reminded her that the North was still a wild land, not easily tamed even by the greatest armies. On one such ride, she paused by a frozen stream, dismounting to let her horse drink from a pool where the ice had cracked. Snow drifted lazily from the gray sky. In the distance, she could see the massive shape of an old pine, branches weighed down by clumps of snow. Beyond that, the faint outlines of rolling hills. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the crisp scent of pine and winter. This was home, this raw, unembellished wilderness where a lone wolf might roam and still find her way back to the pack. Her mind wandered to the south, where Jon and Daenerys likely approached the Trident by now, or even Harrenhal. She wondered how Gendry fared on his journey to Storm's End, if he'd found acceptance among the lords of the Stormlands, or if they scorned him as Robert's bastard. She wondered if Cersei perched in the Red Keep, plotting her enemy's downfall. All these thoughts flitted through her mind, yet they felt distant, overshadowed by the hush of the forest around her. Quietly, she practiced with her dagger. She moved through the stances the faceless men had drilled into her, swift and seamless arcs of steel that sliced through the air with lethal grace. Each motion felt second nature, etched into her muscles. She could end a life in a single heartbeat, slip away unseen, vanish like a gust of wind. That was who she'd become, a lethal phantom shaped by war and loss. Yet in the hush of this forest, she sensed another possibility, the chance to let go of being only a killer. When she eventually returned to Winterfell that afternoon, a light in her eyes hinted at a decision forming in her heart, though she said nothing of it to the others. She resumed her daily routine, checking on the wounded, sparring with a handful of guards, and occasionally offering a wry smile at the swirling rumors that still clung to her name. Time passed in this fashion, more swiftly than she might have guessed. The days gradually lengthened, the worst chill of winter beginning to ease. Sansa received sporadic ravens from the south, bearing news of Daenerys' slow progress toward King's Landing. Cersei, it was said, had raised the city's defenses, lining the walls with scorpions meant to slay dragons and bracing the populace for a siege. The Golden Company had taken up positions around the city, reinforcing the Lannister troops. Rumors abounded. Some said Jaime Lannister had arrived in King's Landing and confronted Cersei only to be thrown in the dungeons. Others insisted that he fought at her side. No one could confirm the truth. Tyrion's letters hinted at negotiations, at attempts to broker a surrender to spare innocent lives. But so far, no resolution had emerged. The shadow of war loomed over the capital, and from the vantage of Winterfell, all Arya could do was imagine how it would unfold. One twilight, Bran summoned Arya and Sansa to the Godwood, where red leaves danced around the ancient weirwood tree, its carved face seeming to watch them with an eerie solemnity. The sky was streaked with purples and oranges, the air still. Bran waited near the heart tree, hands folded in his lap, expression unreadable. Sansa approached first, glancing around. "Is something wrong?" she asked, a note of concern in her voice. Bran looked up at the leaves overhead. "I've been looking," he said softly. "At times, my visions gather around certain events like ravens circling a battlefield. The future can shift, but some moments appear anchored in possibility. King's Landing is on the brink of a choice, one that could shape the realm in blood and fire, or in something else." Arya stepped closer, arms crossed. "Do you see Daenerys winning easily? Do you see the city burning?" Bran's gaze drifted. "I see dragons circling the Red Keep. I see a queen in black and red, and I see an iron throne that might melt. I see a coin that has not yet landed, flipping over and over in the air." Sansa swallowed, her knuckles white against her cloak. "So it's uncertain." Bran nodded. "Uncertain. And yet I sense that Daenerys battles with the memory of her losses and the lure of vengeance. Jon tries to temper her, to spare as many lives as he can. Cersei holds fast, offering no surrender, risking the city's destruction. One spark could ignite a fire beyond control. Perhaps it's best you both know. The North may be safe for now, but the South could shape the future in ways that ripple outward." Sansa's face tightened. "We can't stop it from here. And we've done enough. Our people need us." Arya's thoughts churned. She heard again Daenerys' suggestion that an infiltration might prevent a larger slaughter, and she felt her old recollections stirring. The faces in the Hall of Many-Faced God, the quiet slip of a blade into flesh. The notion that a single dagger could change the fate of thousands. It unsettled her. She glanced at Bran. "Do you see me there?" she asked, a catch in her voice. Bran's pale eyes studied her for a moment. "I see many threads. Some lead you south, some keep you here. Each choice resonates differently, but I cannot tell you which is correct." Arya exhaled. She felt Sansa's gaze flick her way, worried. "Is that something you want?" Sansa asked softly. Arya shook her head. "I don't know. But if Cersei won't surrender, and if Daenerys loses control, how many will die? Jon will be in the thick of it, trying to keep the peace. If he fails, if King's Landing falls to Dragonfire, tens of thousands could perish." Sansa reached out and touched Arya's arm. "Are you thinking of going to kill Cersei yourself?" The directness of the question made Arya flinch. She remembered the name on her old list. Cersei Lannister had been near the top. "Once, I dreamed of that, but everything's changed. Still, if that single action would spare the city from a worse fate, I hate to think it might come to that." Sansa pressed her lips together. "Jon would never want you risking yourself like that. And would it even succeed? Cersei will be guarded by the Golden Company. The King's Guard, Qyburn's twisted inventions." Arya looked to Bran, who said nothing, simply regarding her with that quiet, all-seeing calm. She turned back to Sansa. "I don't know, but if things grow desperate, I might find a way." She tried to put the thought aside afterward, refocusing on the day-to-day tasks in the north. She helped Sansa negotiate with some lesser lords, visited a few outlying villages to check on their welfare, and took long rides among the pine forests. Yet the notion that a single stroke might shape the entire realm kept tugging at her. Her father had always taught her that it was a lord's duty to protect his people, and even though she was not a lord, part of her believed she could protect not just the north but perhaps thousands more if events in King's Landing reached a boiling point. A month passed, then another. Ravens arrived sporadically with news that Daenerys' host had laid siege to King's Landing, cutting off supply lines while demanding Cersei's surrender. Civilians within the city suffered hunger and fear. The dragons soared overhead by day, a constant reminder of devastation waiting to be unleashed. Jon and Tyrion, so the letters said, strove to find a path that would spare the city from ruin, urging Cersei to yield. But she refused. stoking her forces to hold the gates no matter the cost. Anxiety spread through Winterfell. Even Sansa found it difficult to sleep, torn between hope that the conflict would end quickly and dread that news of a massacre would arrive at any moment. Bran gave cryptic hints of how close the city stood to a catastrophic choice. At last, Arya could bear it no longer. She sought Sansa in the library, just as she had all those weeks ago, and found her sister hunched over a small table, reading a newly arrived raven scroll. Sansa looked up, tension carved into the lines of her face. "It's begun," she said. "Their forces have skirmished at the city gates. Civilians are trying to flee, but the gates are sealed. Tyrion wrote that Daenerys is growing impatient. She might unleash her dragons if this goes on much longer." Arya's resolve crystallized. "Then I have to go." Sansa froze, her eyes going wide with alarm. "Arya, no. I have to try," Arya insisted, voice quiet but firm. "If I can reach Cersei, if I can slip past the defenses, maybe I can end her before the city burns. Or maybe I can help Jon find another way. If I don't go, I'll always wonder if I could have done something." Sansa's eyes flickered with 100 emotions. Fear, understanding, frustration, love. "And if you die, what then? We'll lose you. And Jon, he would never forgive himself." Arya's gaze was unyielding. "Better that than 100,000 innocents die because of one woman's pride. You know what Father would say about protecting people who can't protect themselves. And besides, I'm not easy to kill." She forced a small smile. Sansa looked down, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. "You're sure?" Arya placed a hand on her sister's. "I've never been more sure of anything. I won't be rash. If I see it's impossible, I'll slip away. But I have to try." Sansa inhaled unsteadily, then nodded. She rose from her seat, and they embraced, holding each other tightly. "Come back," Sansa whispered. "Whatever happens, come back." Arya felt her throat tighten. "I will." She gathered what she needed for the journey. A stout horse, provisions, warm clothing, and her dagger. She left Needle behind in her room, tucked safely in the corner. Needle was symbolic of her bond to home, and she felt a strange sense that carrying it to King's Landing might weigh her heart too much with memories of the girl she had been. She would travel light, swift, like a faceless shadow. Before dawn the next morning, she rode out. Few were awake to see her leave, though Tormund spotted her from the ramparts and waved. She nodded in return, and then the gates opened to let her pass into the snowy darkness. She pressed her horse onward, heading south by lesser-known roads, determined to stay ahead of any rumors that a Stark might be traveling. The cold air stung her cheeks, and the sky gradually lightened to a pale gray. She felt a mix of nerves and certainty swirl in her belly, reminiscent of how she felt the night she crept toward the Night King. This time, her foe was not an ancient specter of ice, but a queen of flesh and blood, with cunning and cruelty enough to rival any monster. Arya did not relish the idea of another killing, another face to add to the tally of those she'd ended. But if it could save the city and her brother, she would do what was necessary. The journey stretched over days. The winter roads proved treacherous in parts, and she had to navigate carefully, skirting around pockets of bandits who might be desperate. She sometimes sheltered in small villages or at farmhouses, using coin she had taken from Winterfell stores to pay for a warm meal. She kept her face concealed under a hood as much as possible. Once or twice, she heard travelers discussing rumors about King's Landing, how the siege had grown tighter, how Daenerys' dragons circled the city day and night, how there were whispers of wildfire caches beneath the streets. Arya listened in grim silence, then rode on. She chose cunning over speed whenever faced with a potential threat, slipping around outposts of Lannister men or local looters without direct confrontation. There was a time when she would have relished a fight, but she had grown wise enough to avoid one if it served no purpose. Her skill lay in evasion, stealth, unexpected strikes. The memory of the House of Black and White guided her. Quiet footsteps, blending into crowds, wearing invisible faces that no one noticed. When she finally drew near the Crownlands, she saw the signs of war everywhere. churned mud roads, farmers fleeing with their families, burned-out cottages. She began moving with even greater caution, often traveling by night. In the distance, she occasionally glimpsed the faint glow of dragonfire reflecting against clouds, or heard a far-off roar that made her horse snort in alarm. King's Landing awaited her, a city on the brink of cataclysm. So she pressed on, heart resolute, refusing to let fear master her. She would reach the city, slip inside, and find her own way to the heart of Cersei's power. Whether it meant infiltration of the Red Keep or a meeting with Jon and Tyrion first, she would decide once she arrived. Perhaps she could avert a massacre without spilling more blood. Perhaps not. In either case, she would do what Arya Stark had always done. Whatever it took to protect the people she cared about, and to uphold the beliefs her father had instilled in her long ago. Far behind her, the North remained safe under Sansa's guidance, while Bran watched the tapestry of fate unfold through the eyes of ravens. Daenerys and Jon stood before the gates of King's Landing, each day drawing them closer to a final reckoning. And somewhere in the city's labyrinthine streets, Cersei Lannister waited, cunning and ruthless, prepared to sacrifice thousands to keep her throne. As night fell on the rolling plains leading to the capital, Arya spotted the distant glow of torchlight from the Lannister camps and a flicker of watchfires on the city walls. She could smell smoke on the wind, the tang of tension that came before a great storm. Wrapping her cloak tightly around herself, she guided her horse toward a secluded grove where she might rest until dawn, gathering her wits. Tomorrow, she would attempt to enter the city. Tomorrow, the next page of the realm's fate would begin to turn. She tethered her horse under a half-bare oak, feeding it the last of her oats while the animals of the night rustled in the brush around her. The sky above was a tapestry of stars, cold and distant. Arya stared at them, recalling how her mother used to say the stars were the souls of the ancestors watching over them. If that were true, she hoped her father, mother, and Robb might look down on her now, lending her courage in the face of all that awaited. Closing her eyes, she curled up in her cloak, dagger close at hand. She would need every bit of cunning and skill on the morrow. The Queen of the Seven Kingdoms was her new target, one last name from her old list, one last attempt to keep the flames of war from consuming a realm that had barely survived the long night. If anyone could succeed at such an impossible task, it was Arya Stark of Winterfell, the no one who had once killed death itself. She slept, dreamless, ready to begin the final confrontation with mortal ambition. And so the story's path bent once more, forged by the determination of a single girl whose destiny transcended the boundaries of any face, any name, and any throne.